The hangar was dead silent, smelling of burnt ozone and nervous sweat. When the Sovereign bypassed the gold-braided diplomats and stopped in front of a grease-stained mechanic, nobody breathed. She didn't speak at first. Her hand, cool, smooth and trembling, slightly reached out, ignoring protocol, ignoring the dozen rifles aimed at her back. Her fingertips traced the jagged, ruined flesh of his jawline. Then her voice, a raspy echo in his mind, broke the silence. "So it was you, after all these years." The collar of Declan's dress uniform was choking him. It was a stiff, synthetic blend that felt more like sandpaper than fabric, designed by someone who clearly had never been stationed on a deep space orbital platform. Sweat pooled at the base of his neck, trickling down his spine in slow, irritating lines. He shifted his weight from his left boot to his right, wincing as the familiar dull ache in his kneecap flared. The stabilizers in his joint were overdue for a recalibration, but maintenance had been suspended. Everything had been suspended for the treaty. "Stand still, Hayes," Miller hissed from beside him. Declan didn't turn his head. He just ground his teeth, staring straight ahead at the massive blast doors of Hangar Bay 4. "If I stand any stiller, Miller, I'm going to pass out. This collar is cutting off the blood flow to my brain. Better you pass out than make Ambassador Carter look bad." Miller muttered his own face, flushed red beneath the harsh fluorescent glare of the overhead lighting. "Just lock your knees. No, wait. Don't lock your knees. That's how you pass out." Brilliant advice, truly. Declan exhaled slowly through his nose, trying to filter out the smell. Hangar Bay 4 usually smelled like honest work, hydraulic fluid, scorched metal, and the sharp tang of industrial cleaners. Today, it had been scrubbed raw and sprayed with some synthetic floral scent that reminded Declan of cheap funeral parlors. It was a pathetic attempt to mask the reality of the station, a scarred, battered outpost that had barely survived the 7-year border skirmishes. 100 yards ahead, standing on a hastily constructed dais, draped in ridiculous velvet, was Ambassador Carter. Carter was a man who looked like he had been born in a tailored suit. His silver hair perfectly coiffed his posture, radiating the kind of arrogant calm that only came from never having seen a plasma rifle fired in anger. Behind him stood a phalanx of top brass military, their chests heavy with medals won by sending men like Declan into the meat grinder of the outer colonies. Declan was just security detail today. Expendable window dressing. The brass wanted veterans in the background of the broadcast, a silent testament to the sacrifices made for peace. It was a joke, a cynical orchestrated farce. The low bone-rattling hum of a sublight engine began to vibrate through the deck plating. It started in Declan's boots and travelled up his shins, settling in his chest as a tight, anxious flutter. The chatter in the hangar died instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. "They're on approach," Miller whispered, his voice, tighter now, stripped of its previous annoyance. "I can feel it," Declan said softly. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The vibration brought it all back. The memory of the mud, the endless freezing rain on Aegis Prime, the smell of burning hair and vaporized earth. He forced the images down, locking them away in the dark, cramped box in the back of his mind where they belonged. He was a mechanic now, a glorified wrench monkey for the United Earth Coalition. The war was over. Today was the proof. The massive blast doors groaned a terrible screech of strained metal that echoed through the cavernous space. Slowly, agonizingly, they parted. The vacuum shield flickered, casting a sickly blue light over the hangar, before the atmospheric equalizers kicked in. The wind hit them first, a sudden violent gust that swept through the bay, carrying a scent that obliterated the cheap floral spray. It smelled of crushed time, static electricity, and something deeper, something ancient and metallic. It smelled like the dark spaces between stars. The Sovereign's vessel slid through the opening. It wasn't built. It looked grown. A jagged, asymmetrical spear of polished obsidian-like material that seemed to drink the light around it. There were no visible thrusters, no exhaust ports. It moved with a silent, eerie grace, floating above the deck plating before settling down with a soft, organic thud that vibrated deep in Declan's teeth. The hull hissed. A seam appeared in the flawless black surface, splitting open to form a ramp. "Here we go," Miller breathed. Declan swallowed hard, his throat dry. The cynical armor he wore every day felt incredibly thin suddenly. He gripped his ceremonial rifle tighter, his knuckles turning white, as the shadows inside the alien vessel began to move. They descended the ramp in absolute synchronization. There were 6 guards, towering figures clad in armor that looked like overlapping plates of hardened chitin and dark metal. They didn't march. They flowed their movements, possessing a predatory fluid grace that made the human soldiers standing at attention look clumsy and rigid by comparison. Their faces were obscured by blank, angular masks, their weapons integrated directly into their forearms, but Declan's eyes, like everyone else's in the hangar, were drawn instantly to the figure walking behind them. The Sovereign. She was devastatingly tall, clearing the tallest of her guards by a head. She wore no armor, only draped layers of a material that shifted in color from deep crimson to bruised purple with every step she took. Her skin was a pale, translucent gray, marked by subtle iridescent veins that pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent glow at her temples and throat. Her face was a stark architecture of sharp angles, high, severe cheekbones, a strong, unyielding jawline, and eyes that were entirely fathomlessly black. There were no pupils, no whites, just twin pools of midnight that reflected the harsh hangar lights with an unsettling clarity. She didn't walk so much as glide. Every step was deliberate, carrying the immense, crushing weight of absolute authority. Ambassador Carter stepped forward, his perfectly practiced smile plastered across his face. He extended a hand, a gesture of universal goodwill that suddenly looked incredibly foolish. "Sovereign!" Carter projected his voice, amplified by the hangar's acoustics. "On behalf of the United Earth Coalition, I welcome you to Station Vanguard. Today, we bridge the divide between our peoples." The Sovereign did not look at him. She did not stop. Carter's smile faltered, his extended hand dropping slightly. The military brass behind him stiffened hands, hovering nervously near their sidearms. The air in the hangar turned brittle, ready to snap. The Sovereign bypassed the dais entirely. She walked past the terrified ambassador, past the bristling generals, and stepped down onto the main deck. She was moving toward the perimeter, toward the security line, toward Declan. "What is she doing?" Miller panicked under his breath, his voice barely a squeak. "Hayes! Hayes, what the hell is she doing?" Declan didn't answer. He couldn't. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct, honed by years of surviving a war against her kind, was screaming at him to raise his rifle to seek cover to run. But his boots felt welded to the deck. She was looking directly at him. Those endless black eyes were locked onto his face, cutting through the distance between them. The closer she got, the more the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Declan could see the subtle shift of the muscles beneath her pale skin, the faint, rhythmic pulse of the bioluminescence at her throat. He could smell that electric ozone scent, overpowering everything else. The 6 guards fanned out behind her, a silent, lethal crescent. The human soldiers in the perimeter line shrank back instinctively, their discipline crumbling under the sheer, suffocating presence of the alien matriarch. Declan held his ground, not out of bravery, but out of a stubborn, paralytic shock. He felt raw, exposed. The dress uniform suddenly felt like paper. She stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him. Up close, the details of her were overwhelming. The shifting fabric of her garments made a sound like dry leaves scraping together. Her breath, when it parted, her pale lips, was a cool draft against Declan's sweating face. He had to crane his neck back slightly to meet her gaze, his jaw tight. The hangar was a tomb. The cameras in the upper gantry were silent. Ambassador Carter was frozen on the dais, his mouth slightly open. Declan stared into the black void of her eyes. He saw no hostility. He saw no diplomatic calculation. He saw a terrifying, overwhelming intensity that made his chest ache. Slowly, deliberately, the sovereign raised her hand. Her fingers were long, the joints too numerous, tapering to blunted, dark tips. As her hand encroached on his personal space, the human snipers in the rafters undoubtedly tightened their grips on their triggers. One sudden movement, one perceived threat, and the hangar would erupt into a bloodbath. Declan's breath hitched. He didn't flinch. He forced himself to remain perfectly still, even as every nerve ending in his body screamed in protest. Do it, he thought cynically, his mind racing. Rip my throat out. Start the war again. At least it'd be honest. Her hand didn't go for his throat. Her fingertips cool as polished stone and trembling with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, brushed against the right side of his face. The touch was electric. A sharp static shock snapped against Declan's skin, but it didn't burn. It sent a shiver down his spine that settled heavy in his gut. Her fingers bypassed the pristine fabric of his collar, seeking the exposed flesh above it. She traced the scar. It was an ugly thing, a thick, raised mass of twisted pink and white tissue that started just below his ear, jagged down his jawline, and disappeared into his collar. It looked like melted wax, a permanent, brutal reminder of a plasma cutter misfire. It was the reason he rarely looked in mirrors. It was the reason he drank too much on the anniversary of the Oakhaven drop. Her touch was agonizingly slow, mapping the ruin of his face with a reverence that made Declan's stomach twist. Her fingertips were impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the lethal, bladed look of her entire species. Declan's breath shuddered out of him. The cynical, hardened shell he'd built over the last decade cracked. The smell of ozone and crushed time suddenly twisted, morphing in his memory into the stench of wet ash and burning mud. Oakhaven. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The torrential, blinding rain, the mud that sucked at his boots, trying to drag him down into the earth, the desperate, shrieking whine of artillery tearing the sky apart. He had been a grunt, a nobody, separated from his unit, half blind from a concussion, crawling through the wreckage of a downed Elysian transport ship looking for cover. He remembered the collapsed bulkhead. He remembered the sound. A low, pathetic keen, entirely unhuman, but universally desperate. He had found one of them. A prisoner he had assumed, or a juvenile. It had been smaller than the warriors they usually fought, its pale skin, bruised and bleeding, pinned beneath a massive steel beam. It had hissed at him a weak, dying sound, its black eyes wide with terror as Declan approached, his plasma rifle raised. He was supposed to kill it. That was the standing order. No prisoners, no mercy. Instead, he had dropped the rifle. He had pulled his industrial plasma cutter from his hip. The sovereign's fingers lingered on the thickest part of the scar right over his jawbone. Declan swallowed his throat, working convulsively. He remembered the rain hissing against the superheated metal of the beam. He remembered the warning light on the cutter blinking red, a pressure malfunction. He hadn't cared. He had kept cutting, determined to free the creature. Then the explosion. A blinding flash of blue-white agony. The smell of his own burning flesh. The world tilting sideways as the cutter blew up in his face, taking a chunk of his jaw with it. He remembered waking up in the mud, half blinded by blood, screaming in pain. The beam had been severed. The creature was free. It had stood over him, trembling, looking down at his ruined face. He had expected it to finish him off. Instead, it had reached out, a cool, terrified hand, pressing against his burning neck, trying to staunch the bleeding. Then, hearing the approach of human sirens, it had fled into the tree line, disappearing into the dark. Declan blinked, snapping back to the present. The harsh lights of Hangar Bay 4 stung his eyes. The Sovereign was still looking at him. The terrifying, imposing mask of the alien matriarch had fractured. Her jaw was tight, and the bioluminescent veins at her temples were pulsing rapidly, erratically. She stepped closer, completely invading his space. Her height forced Declan to look up, exposing his throat entirely to her. "The rain," she whispered. Her voice wasn't projected this time. It was soft, raspy, carrying the strange dual-toned resonance of her species, but the words were perfectly, flawlessly human. Declan's heart stopped. His hands went numb. "The rain," she repeated, her black eyes locked onto his, searching his face, peeling back the years, the cynicism, the weary mechanic he had become, finding the broken, bleeding boy in the mud. It burned. The metal. It burned. A collective gasp rippled through the hangar. Ambassador Carter dropped his datapad. It hit the deck with a sharp clatter, but neither Declan nor the Sovereign looked away. Her thumb stroked the scar tissue one last time, a gesture so deeply, impossibly human that Declan felt a sudden, terrifying urge to cry. The sheer weight of the moment crushed the air from his lungs. It hadn't just been a juvenile. It hadn't been a grunt. He had ripped his own face apart to save the future queen of a hostile empire. The Sovereign slowly lowered her hand. She took a half step back, her posture shifting. The vulnerability vanished, swallowed instantly by the regal, terrifying presence of the matriarch. But her eyes never left his. "I was told," she said, her voice louder now, carrying the raspy, commanding echo that filled the hangar, "that the humans of the Coalition were beasts, that they knew only destruction, that they possessed no concept of sacrifice beyond their own kind." She slowly turned her head, casting a chilling, disdainful glare over the assembled diplomats on the dais, before looking back at Declan. The corner of her mouth twitched upward, a subtle alien approximation of a smile that made Declan's blood run cold, yet sent a strange thrill through his chest. "So it was you," the Sovereign murmured, the words meant only for him, heavy with a decade of unspoken debt. After all these years, the silence shattered the moment the Sovereign turned her back on him. It didn't break with a roar, but with a chaotic, suffocating murmur that swept through Hangar Bay 4 like a sudden pressure drop. Ambassador Carter's voice cracked over the comms, a shrill, undignified sound. "Wait, Sovereign, the protocol dictates—" She didn't stop. Her 6 guards collapsed back into their crescent formation, perfectly boxing her in, and the entire alien delegation moved toward the designated VIP transit corridors without a single backward glance. Declan was still staring at the empty space where she had just been. The skin of his jaw burned. It wasn't the heat of a plasma fire this time, but a phantom echo, a tingling static that seemed to seep straight through his pores and into his blood. Hayes, a heavy hand, clamped down on his shoulder, fingers digging hard into his collarbone. Declan blinked the harsh hangar lights, suddenly blinding again. General Briggs was standing beside him, his face a mottled, dangerous shade of purple. The medals on Briggs's chest clinked together, a hollow, tinny sound. "Sir." Declan managed his voice, sounding like it belonged to someone else. It was rough, scraped, dry. "Give me the rifle, Corporal." Briggs ordered his voice, dangerously quiet. Before Declan could unclip the strap, 2 military police officers materialized on his other side. They moved with aggressive efficiency, stripping the ceremonial weapon from his hands and grabbing his biceps. "Hey, wait a minute," Miller said, taking a half step forward from his position in the security line. "He didn't do anything." She approached him. "Stand down, Private." Briggs barked, not even looking at Miller. He kept his eyes locked on Declan, his expression a mix of profound confusion and deep-seated paranoia. "Get him out of here. Bring him to interrogation room C. Total blackout. Nobody speaks to him." The walk through the station's lower decks was a blur. The MPs didn't speak. Their grips on his arms were tight enough to leave bruises, dragging him away from the polished, perfumed facade of the hangar and down into the station's guts. The synthetic floral smell faded, replaced by the comforting, familiar stench of recycled air bleach and old grease. Interrogation room C was a windowless box of grey steel and brushed aluminum. The temperature was set to a brisk 60 degrees to keep subjects awake. They shoved him into a rigid metal chair, bolted to the floor, and left him alone. The heavy mag lock on the door engaged with a loud final clank. Declan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the cold steel table. He buried his face in his hands, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes until he saw bursts of dull-colored light. His jaw throbbed. He reached up his fingers, gingerly tracing the thick, uneven ridges of the scar. The metal. It burned. He hadn't thought about Oakhaven in years. He had actively, aggressively trained himself not to. He drank cheap station synthetic whiskey until the memories went numb, and he buried himself in the guts of broken sublight engines until he couldn't think at all. He had convinced himself that the creature in the mud had been a hallucination, a fever dream brought on by blood loss and a grade 3 concussion. But she was real, the sovereign of the Elysian Empire, the leader of a species that had nearly glassed 3 human colonies, and she had looked at him like he was a god in the dirt. The door hissed open. General Briggs walked in, followed by a man Declan didn't recognize. The second man wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that didn't belong on a military outpost. He had pale, watery eyes and the relaxed, predatory slouch of an intelligence officer. Briggs slammed a datapad onto the table. "Start talking, Hayes." Declan looked up, dropping his hands. "About what, General?" "Don't play stupid with me." Briggs snarled, leaning over the table. The smell of stale coffee and peppermint antacids rolled off him. "You broke protocol. You engaged the Sovereign." "I didn't move a muscle," Declan said, his voice, flat, the old, cynical mechanic, creeping back into his tone to protect the raw nerve underneath. "She walked up to me. You saw it." The intelligence officer pulled out the chair opposite Declan and sat down slowly. "I'm Agent Collins, Coalition Intelligence. Corporal Declan Hayes. Honorable discharge 7 years ago, after the Aegis Prime campaign. Medical retirement due to severe facial trauma. Rehired as a civilian contractor, Class 4 mechanic." Collins tilted his head. "You're a grease monkey, Mr. Hayes. Why did the supreme ruler of a hostile alien empire just stroke your face like you're an old lover?" Declan's stomach tightened. He hated the word lover. It made the terrifying, bloody memory sound cheap. "I don't know." He lied. The lie tasted like ash. "Bullshit," Briggs snapped. "I don't know," Declan repeated louder this time. He glared at the general. "I was a grunt on Oakhaven. I got blown up. I spent 6 months in a burn ward, and the next 6 years fixing your broken garbage scows. You think I have a secret comms line to the Elysian homeworld?" Collins watched him, his watery eyes unblinking. "She spoke to you. The audio pickups on the gantry caught a localized acoustic projection, but the encryption scrambled the translation matrix." "What did she say?" Declan ground his teeth. The rain, the metal, it burned. "So it was you, after all these years." "She didn't say anything." Declan lied again. "It was just static, Elysian clicks and hisses." "Are you aware, Mr. Hayes," Collins said softly, leaning forward, "that Ambassador Carter is currently sitting in a negotiation suite looking at an empty chair?" Declan frowned, his brow furrowing. "What?" The Sovereign refused to take her seat. Collins continued, his voice perfectly, even devoid of any inflection. "Her delegation has locked down their sector. They've shut off life support to the hallway, flooded it with their own atmospheric mix, and deployed heavy countermeasures. The treaty talks are completely stalled. We are currently sitting on a powder keg that could reignite a 7-year war." Briggs slammed his fist on the table, making Declan jump. "And she gave Carter exactly one condition before she sealed the doors." Declan felt a cold, sharp dread pool in his gut. He looked back and forth between the two men. "What condition?" Collins smiled. It was a thin, joyless expression. "She wants the mechanic. She says she will only negotiate with the man with the burned face. They didn't give him time to change out of his dress uniform. They didn't even let him grab his anxiety medication from his locker. Within 10 minutes, Declan was marching down the sterile, white-lit corridors of Sector 4, flanked by 4 heavily armed coalition Marines. The gravity plating in this section of the station felt heavier, pulling at the recalibration sensors in his bad knee. He limped slightly, a dull rhythmic pain shooting up his thigh with every step. "Check your weapons," the squad leader muttered as they approached the heavy blast doors of the VIP suite. "Safety off. If those things twitch, you put them down." Declan looked at the squad leader, a kid who couldn't have been older than 20. He hadn't fought in the war. He didn't know what it took to put an Elysian down. "If you shoot," Declan said, his voice quiet, but grating like rough grit, "make sure you kill the first one, because the second one will rip your head off before the casing hits the floor." The kid swallowed hard, his knuckles turning white on his rifle. The blast doors were flanked by 2 Elysian guards. Standing completely motionless, they looked like statues carved from volcanic glass. As the human contingent approached, the guards fluidly uncrossed their arms. The movement was entirely silent, but the threat was deafening. Agent Collins, who had followed them, stepped forward. He held up a small encoded keycard. "We brought him. Open the door." One of the guards tilted its masked head. A low, clicking vibration rattled from its chest, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in Declan's sternum. The heavy doors groaned and parted, revealing a thick, swirling curtain of pale blue mist. "In you go, Mr. Hayes," Collins said, stepping back safely behind the line of Marines. "Remember, you are representing the Coalition. Find out what she wants, and get Carter back in the room." Declan sneered at him. "Right. I'll just use my extensive background in intergalactic diplomacy. Should I offer her a wrench or a socket set?" He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped over the threshold and into the mist. The blast doors slammed shut behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. The air in the suite was immediately oppressively different. It was humid, thick with moisture that clung to the synthetic fabric of his uniform. The temperature had plummeted, hovering somewhere just above freezing. But it was the smell that hit him the hardest. The sharp metallic ozone, the crushed thyme, the deep, earthy scent of wet soil. It was the smell of Oak Haven, They had terraformed a luxury space station suite to smell like a battlefield. "You came," the voice came from the shadows. It was that same dual-toned resonance, a harsh, scraping sound, layered beneath a smooth, flawless human pronunciation. Declan squinted through the mist. The standard station lighting had been disabled, replaced by a dim, bioluminescent glow that emanated from strange, crystalline structures placed around the room. She was standing by the massive viewport, looking out at the sprawling black void of space. She had shed the heavy shifting layers she wore in the hangar. Now she was clad in something much simpler, a dark, form-fitting material that exposed her arms and shoulders. Her pale grey skin seemed to absorb the dim light, and the iridescent veins along her neck pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm. Declan cleared his throat. It felt dry and tight. I didn't have much of a choice. They practically marched me here at gunpoint. The Sovereign turned slowly. In the dim light, her pure black eyes looked like deep, empty wells. She moved toward him, her bare feet making absolutely no sound on the metal deck. "They fear me," she stated. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple, empirical observation. "Yeah, well," Declan shifted his weight, wincing as his knee popped. "You guys aren't exactly known for your warm hugs. You glassed New Corinth, wiped out 3 million people." He expected anger. He expected her to strike him. Instead, she stopped a few feet away, her expression completely unreadable. "And your people bombarded the breeding spires on Kalan Tor." She replied, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, vibrating with a cold, terrifying grief. "Millions of unhatched, burned to ash before they could draw their first breath." The blunt, ugly truth of the war hung between them, heavy and suffocating in the humid air. Declan looked away, his jaw clenching. He hated the politicians. He hated the generals who moved lines on a map while people bled in the mud. "I was just a grunt," Declan said, his voice bitter. "I didn't order the bombardments. I just turned wrenches and carried a rifle because they told me to." "I know." She stepped closer, invading his space again. The sheer, overwhelming height of her made Declan feel acutely human, acutely fragile. "That day," she murmured, her gaze dropping from his eyes to his ruined jaw. The transport ship fell from the sky. It crashed into the mud. I was trapped beneath the metal. "You were a kid," Declan said quietly, looking back at her. "You were small, half the size you are now. I didn't know you were, whatever you are, royalty." "I was not sovereign then," she said. "I was a fledgling of the royal clutch, a target of opportunity for your soldiers. When I saw you approach with your weapon raised, I prepared to return to the earth." Declan swallowed. The memory of the rain, the hissing metal, the overwhelming instinct to just help something that was suffering regardless of its species. "I couldn't do it. You were just lying there bleeding." "You dropped your weapon," she said, her black eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him want to step back. But he didn't. He held his ground. "You took a tool of construction, and you tried to cut the metal. It was unstable. It detonated." She reached out just as she had in the hangar. Declan forced himself not to flinch. Her cool, blunt fingertips brushed against the scarred skin. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to his chest. "Your flesh melted," she whispered, her voice carrying a strange, haunting reverence. "You screamed, yet you did not reach for your weapon. You did not blame me. You only bled." "Yeah, well," Declan muttered, trying to mask the sudden, terrifying swell of emotion in his throat with dry cynicism. "I wasn't exactly thinking straight. Shock does weird things to a guy." Her hand dropped. "Your people. They are a contradiction. You build weapons that shatter planets, yet you destroy your own face to save an enemy you were ordered to kill. We're messy, Declan agreed, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. Look, Sovereign. Vile. Declan stopped. What? My designation. My name in your tongue, she said, lifting her chin slightly. You bled for me. You carry my mark upon your face. You may call me Vale. Declan stared at her. The idea of calling the terrifying alien matriarch by a first name felt absurd, like calling a hurricane Breeze. But there was an earnestness in her dark eyes, a strange alien vulnerability that he couldn't ignore. All right. Vile. He tested the name. It felt strange on his tongue. Why am I here? They told me you stalled the treaty. Carter is sweating through his suit out there. If you want peace, you need to talk to the diplomats, not a grease monkey. Vielle turned away from him, walking back toward the viewport. She stared out at the stars, her posture suddenly rigid, the bioluminescent veins on her neck pulsing faster. I do not trust the men in the suits, she said coldly. They speak with two tongues. They smile while their hands rest upon the hilts of their blades. That's politics, Declan said, leaning against a bulkhead, trying to take the weight off his bad knee. It's ugly, but it's how they stop the shooting. It is a lie, Vielle countered, spinning back to face him. Her movement was so fast, so fluid, it made Declan's heart skip a beat. The treaty is a fragile shell, and there are those within my own ranks, generals of the old blood who do not wish the shell to hold. Declan frowned, the cynical fog in his brain clearing instantly. You have a rebellion on your hands. I have a fracture, she corrected, pacing the room with long, predatory strides. My authority is absolute, but the hatred runs deep. If I sign this treaty with a human who reeks of deception, my generals will use it as proof of my weakness. They will shatter the peace, and the burning will begin again. She stopped pacing and looked directly at him. The sheer weight of her gaze felt physical, pinning him to the bulkhead. I need an anchor, Vielle said, her voice dropping to a harsh, resonant whisper. I need a human who knows the cost of the fire, a human who does not hide behind a false smile, a human who chose the meat over the metal. Declan realized with a sudden sinking dread exactly what she was asking. No, he said, shaking his head, pushing off the bulkhead. No, absolutely not. Vielle, you've got the wrong guy. I fix engines. I drink too much. I have a bad knee and a face that scares small children. I am not a diplomat. I do not want a diplomat. She stepped toward him, closing the distance in a heartbeat. I want a witness. I want you. You're crazy. Declan blurted out the sheer absurdity of the situation, overriding his survival instincts. He ran a hand through his short, grease-stained hair, pacing away from her. The damp, cold air of the room was making his scar ache a deep, pulsing throb. You think Briggs and Carter are going to let me anywhere near that negotiating table? They think I'm a security risk. They probably think I'm an Elysian sleeper agent right now. Vielle watched him pace her head, tilting slightly to the side, observing his frantic, deeply human agitation with an eerie calm. They will let you, she stated with absolute certainty. Because if they do not, I will take my fleet and return to the void, and their precious station will be the first casualty of the renewed conflict. Declan stopped dead in his tracks. He turned to look at her, his eyes wide. She wasn't bluffing. There was no theatricality in her posture, no malice in her tone. It was simply a fact. She was willing to burn the galaxy down if he didn't sit in a chair. Why? Declan's voice cracked. The exhaustion, the years of pain, the relentless weight of the war all crashed down on him at once. Why me? Because of one stupid decision I made 7 years ago. I was a kid. I was scared. I didn't know what I was doing." "You knew exactly what you were doing," Vial said softly. She closed the distance between them again. She moved with such unnatural grace that she seemed to simply appear in front of him. She reached out, but this time she didn't touch his face. She reached for his left hand. Declan stiffened, but he didn't pull away. Her fingers, long and cool, wrapped around his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly gentle, yet he could feel the terrifying, coiled strength beneath her skin. If she wanted to, she could snap his forearm like a dry twig. Instead, she slowly lifted his hand, turning it palm up. Her thumb traced the thick calluses on his palms, the deep-set grease stains that never completely washed out the jagged white lines of minor cuts and burns that mapped a life of hard physical labor. "Your people measure worth in gold, in titles, in words, spoken from high platforms," Vial murmured, staring at his rough working man's hand. "My people measure worth in blood, in scars, in actions taken when the fire is hottest." She looked up, meeting his gaze. Her black eyes were impossibly deep, a stark contrast to the pale, translucent grey of her face. "You bound us together in the mud on Oakhaven," she continued, her voice resonating in his chest. "You broke your own form to preserve mine. In the old tongue of my ancestors, that is the Kalendar, the blood debt. It is a bond stronger than any treaty forged by politicians." Declan stared at her, his pulse hammering against her cool grip. He felt profoundly exposed, stripped of his cynical armor. She wasn't looking at a broken mechanic. She was looking at a warrior who had saved her life. "I'm broken, Vial," he whispered, the admission tearing out of his throat, raw and painful. "I wake up sweating in the middle of the night. I jump when a wrench hits the deck too hard. I'm not some hero you can prop up to keep your generals in line. I'll fail." Vial's expression didn't change, but her thumb stopped moving, pressing firmly into the center of his palm. "A flawless blade is weak," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "It shatters upon the first strike of heavy armor. The strongest steel is the steel that has been melted, beaten, and fractured, only to be forged again. Your scars do not make you broken, Declan. They make you forged." Hearing his name spoken in her raspy, dual-toned voice sent a shiver down his spine. It felt heavy, laden with a sudden, terrifying significance. "I need you," Vial said, dropping the philosophical edge, her tone turning urgent, almost pleading. It was a staggering vulnerability from a creature that looked like a nightmare woven from shadows. "If I stand alone among your smiling wolves, my generals will see my isolation as weakness. If you stand with me marked by my survival, they will see strength. They will see the Kalendar." Declan looked down at their connected hands, the pale, elegant alien fingers wrapped around his scarred, calloused skin. It was a bizarre, impossible picture. The grease monkey and the alien queen. He thought about Miller standing in the security line, terrified. He thought about the kids on the station who had never known a sky that wasn't choked with orbital defense grids. He thought about the endless freezing rain on Oakhaven and the desperate, dying sound she had made beneath the metal. If he walked out that door and refused, the war would start again. The skies would burn. More kids would die in the mud. He took a slow, deep breath. The air smelled of crushed time and ozone. It didn't smell like a battlefield anymore. It smelled like her. "All right," Declan said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. He gently pulled his hand free from hers, not out of revulsion, but out of a sudden need for agency. "All right, I'll do it." Vial's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the subtle, bioluminescent pulsing at her temples, slowing to a steady, calm rhythm. She inclined her head, a gesture of profound respect. "But we do it my way." Declan continued his cynicism, flaring back up a necessary shield. "I'm not wearing this ridiculous collar. I'm not saluting Ambassador Carter. And if Briggs tries to give me an order, I'm going to tell him to shove it." The corner of Vial's mouth twitched that same terrifying alien approximation of a smile she had shown in the hangar. It was a predator's amusement, and it made the hairs on the back of Declan's neck stand up. "You shall speak as you wish," she agreed, turning toward the heavy blast doors. "You answer only to me. Come, Declan. Let us go and terrify the men in the suits." Declan unbuttoned the stiff, choking collar of his dress uniform, letting out a long sigh of relief. He reached down and adjusted the knee brace under his trousers. It was going to be a long day. He fell into step beside the Sovereign, the mechanic walking shoulder to shoulder with the matriarch of the Elysian Empire. The heavy blast doors groaned open, revealing the swirling mist and the terrified, wide-eyed human marines waiting on the other side. As they stepped out into the harsh, sterile light of the corridor, Declan didn't look at the guns. He didn't look at Agent Collins's pale, calculating eyes. He kept his head up the terrible melted scar on his jaw, exposed for everyone to see. For the first time in 7 years, he didn't want to hide it. The primary negotiation theater on Station Vanguard was designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous circular room, situated at the very apex of the station, crowned by a massive transparent dome that offered a dizzying, unprotected view of the planet below and the endless void beyond. The table in the center was carved from a single slab of Martian basalt, heavy, dark, and unforgiving. When the heavy blast doors slid open, the silence in the room wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. Ambassador Carter sat at the head of the human side, his perfectly tailored suit looking suddenly too large for him. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the glare of the recessed lighting. General Briggs sat to his right, his jaw clamped so tight the muscles bulged beneath his skin. A dozen other diplomats and aides hovered like nervous flies. On the opposite side sat the Elysian delegation, 4 massive generals clad in heavy ceremonial armor that looked like a cross between insectoid chitin and forged steel. They didn't sit. They loomed in specially constructed support frames, their masked faces fixed on the empty space at the center of their line. The air on their side of the room was visibly distorted, chilled by portable atmospheric generators that bled a faint, icy mist over the basalt table. Declan felt the heat of a dozen human stares hit him the moment he stepped through the threshold. He didn't care. The pain in his knee was a steady rhythmic throb, grounding him in the physical reality of the moment. He walked beside Vial, feeling the sudden drop in temperature as she entered the room. The scent of ozone and crushed time washed over the sterile, recirculated air of the theater, obliterating Carter's expensive sandalwood cologne. "Sovereign!" Carter stood up so fast his chair screeched against the deck plating. He offered a tight, desperate smile. "We are relieved you have returned. We were beginning to fear a miscommunication." Vial didn't look at him. She glided to the center of the Elysian line. The 4 massive generals shifted a unified rustle of heavy armor and low clicking vibrations that rattled the coffee cups on the human side of the table. Declan stopped just behind her left shoulder. He felt completely ridiculous. His dress uniform was unbuttoned at the collar, exposing the jagged melted flesh of his scar to the harsh overhead lights. He had axle grease under his fingernails and a severe limp. "There was no miscommunication, Ambassador," Vial said. Her voice, carrying that strange, dual-toned resonance, filled the massive room without her needing to raise it. "There was an evaluation," She turned her head slightly, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. It was a high-backed seat, intended for her second-in-command. "Sit, Declan," she commanded softly. The name dropped into the silent room like a live grenade. Carter choked on his next breath. General Briggs stood up, his face flushing a dangerous apoplectic red. "Now wait just a damn minute. Sovereign, that man is a civilian contractor. He has absolutely no security clearance, no diplomatic standing, and no right to be at this table." The largest of the Elysian generals, a terrifying behemoth covered in jagged obsidian black plates, stepped forward. He emitted a series of rapid aggressive clicks, his masked head snapping toward Declan. The hostility radiating from the creature was physical, like standing too close to an open furnace. General Corv objects to the human's presence. Vielle translated her voice utterly devoid of emotion, though the bioluminescent veins at her temples flared bright. He states that a creature of grease and rust has no place among the forged. General Corv and I finally agree on something, Briggs snarled, slamming his fist on the basalt table. "Hayes, step away from that chair and report to the security detail immediately." "That is a direct order." Declan looked at Briggs. He saw the medals. He saw the spotless uniform. Then he looked at the sprawling mass of the Elysian General Corv, whose armor was scored with plasma burns and kinetic impacts. Declan's knee ached. His jaw burned. The cynical protective shell he'd worn for 7 years finally cracked, not from fear, but from profound, overwhelming exhaustion. He was so tired of old men in safe rooms, screaming at each other, while kids bled in the dirt. He didn't salute Briggs. He didn't even acknowledge the order. Instead, Declan pulled the heavy chair out the metal legs, scraping loudly across the floor, and sat down right next to the sovereign of the Elysian Empire. He leaned back, resting his grease-stained hands on the polished basalt. He looked across the table at Briggs, his expression deadpan. "I'm off the clock, General. You want me gone, you're going to have to shoot me. And I don't think the sovereign would like the mess." Briggs looked like he was about to draw his sidearm. Carter frantically grabbed the general's arm, pulling him back down into his seat, his eyes darting terrified between Declan and Vale. General Corv let out a low, deafening hiss, his massive hands gripping the edge of the table so hard the stone groaned. Vielle slowly raised her hand. It was a subtle gesture, just a slight lifting of her pale fingers, but Corv instantly fell silent. He didn't back down his posture, still radiating lethal violence, but he stopped moving. The mechanic remains. Vielle declared, her black eyes locking onto Carter. "He carries the Kylandar, the blood debt. He is the only human in this sector who understands the cost of the fire. You will speak to me, Ambassador, but you will not lie. Because if you do, he will know." She sat down. The room was perfectly, terrifyingly still. Declan stared at his own hands, resting on the cold stone. He was in the crosshairs of 2 empires, armed with nothing but a bad attitude and a busted face. "All right," he thought, a grim, humorless smile touching the corner of his unscarred cheek. "Let's see if we can fix this engine." The negotiations dragged on for 3 excruciating hours. It was exactly the kind of sterile, bureaucratic nightmare Declan despised. Carter spoke in circles using phrases like phased demilitarization, economic reciprocity, and mutual security corridors. He was trying to wrap a garrote wire in velvet, attempting to secure human control over the resource-rich Aegis sector, without explicitly saying so. Vielle sat motionless, her face an unreadable mask. She countered Carter's slick proposals with blunt, uncompromising demands. She didn't care about trade routes. She cared about the safety of the Elysian breeding spires. She demanded the complete dismantling of the Coalition's orbital defense grid over 3 border colonies. Every time Carter tried to obfuscate, Vielle would look at Declan. She wouldn't speak. She would just turn her head, those fathomless black eyes settling on his face. And Declan, leaning back in his chair, feeling the deep ache in his bones, would translate the political garbage into plain, ugly truth. He means they want to keep the mining rigs active. Vale. Declan rasped after Carter finished a 10-minute monologue about shared resource stewardship. They'll pull the troops out, but they'll leave private security contractors, mercenaries. It's a back door. Carter looked like he wanted to vomit. Mr. Hayes, you are fundamentally misunderstanding the nuances of the— Am I? Declan cut him off, his voice flat. He pointed a grease-stained finger at the holographic map hovering above the center of the table. I used to repair the dropships that ran security for those mining corps. They're heavily armed, entirely unregulated, and they shoot anything that moves within a 50-mile radius. You leave them there, it's just a proxy war. Vile's eyes snapped back to Carter. The sector will be purged of all human presence, corporate or military, or the treaty dies. The Elysian generals clicked their approval, a sound like a swarm of massive locusts. Corv, however, was not satisfied. The holographic map shifted to the Oakhaven system. It was the deepest scar of the war, the planet where millions had died in the mud, where Declan had lost his face. The Oakhaven system remains a contested zone. Briggs growled, finding his nerve. We spilled too much blood there to simply hand it over. The coalition requires a permanent garrison. General Corv lunged forward against his support frame. The translator collar at his throat crackled as it converted his aggressive clicks into harsh metallic English. You claim blood human. Your species drowned the soil of Oakhaven in the ashes of our young. We demand unconditional surrender of the system and the immediate execution of the architects of the orbital bombardment. Corv's masked face turned directly toward Briggs. The air in the room turned brittle. Carter scrambled for his datapad. Now, General Corv war crimes tribunals are a complex international matter. It is our price for peace. Corv roared, his massive fists slamming onto the basalt table. A web of hairline fractures spidered out from the impact zone. Your words are empty air. You offer paper while hiding your knives. The Sovereign is blinded by a solitary act of a broken grunt. Corv pointed a massive bladed finger directly at Declan. He is nothing a scavenger. We should burn this station to slag and take our worlds back by force. The human marines lining the walls raised their rifles. The Elysian Guard stepped forward, their arm-mounted weapons humming to life. The treaty was evaporating in a span of 5 seconds. Vile stood up. The movement was a blur of dark fabric and terrible grace. The temperature in the room plummeted further, frost rapidly crystallizing on the edges of the holographic projector. But before she could speak, before she could unleash the authority that kept the generals in check, Declan moved. He didn't stand up. His knee wouldn't let him do it fast enough anyway. Instead, he leaned forward, planting his elbows heavily on the table. He ignored Briggs. He ignored Carter. He looked directly up at the towering, lethal mass of General Corv. "You're right," Declan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was rough, scraped dry like sandpaper on rust. It cut through the rising panic in the room precisely because it was so calm. Corv froze, his bladed finger still pointing at Declan's chest. The other Elysian generals tilted their heads. Vielle looked down at him, her bioluminescent veins pulsing in rapid, surprised flashes. "You're absolutely right," Declan repeated, tapping his calloused fingers against the basalt. "I'm a scavenger. I'm a grease monkey. I spend 12 hours a day, elbow deep in the busted guts of the ships you shot up." He shifted his gaze, locking eyes with the hostile general. "But because I fix them, I know exactly what kind of shape they're in." Declan continued his tone, turning hard, entirely stripped of fear. "Your dreadnoughts out there, the ones currently holding this station hostage, they're venting plasma. Their sublight manifolds are patched with spit and wire. You've been running them hot for 7 years without dry dock. One coordinated EMP strike, and half your fleet becomes drifting coffins." Corv let out a low, dangerous hiss, but he didn't interrupt. Declan turned to look at Briggs. "And don't look so smug, General. Our fleet is worse. We're rationing deuterium. We're deploying kids who barely know how to hold a rifle, putting them in armor that's been welded together from scrap. If Corv opens fire today, we might take a few of them down, but Station Vanguard will be a debris field in exactly 4 minutes. Declan leaned back, the silence in the room, heavy and suffocating. He looked back and forth between the two sides. 2 empires, both bleeding out, both too proud to admit they were dying. "You both want blood," Declan said, his voice dropping to a weary, cynical rasp. He reached up his fingers, brushing the thick, ugly mass of scar tissue on his jaw. "You think war is glorious. You think it's about honor. It's not. War is a blown engine. It's metal tearing, flesh burning, and kids dying in the mud screaming for their mothers. I know. I was there." He stared at Corv. "You want to burn this station? Do it. But don't stand there and pretend it's about strength. It's because you're too much of a coward to figure out how to stop the engine from tearing itself apart." Nobody breathed. The Marines were statues. Carter was pale as a ghost. Briggs's mouth was slightly open. To speak to an Elysian general with such blatant suicidal disrespect was a death sentence. Declan waited for the blow. He waited for the plasma bolt to take his head off. Corv stared at the mechanic. The alien's heavy chest heaved the translator collar, clicking and whirring softly. Then slowly the massive general lowered his hand. He looked at Declan's ruined face, then at his grease-stained hands. "He speaks without the honey." Corv rumbled his voice, losing its aggressive edge, replaced by a grudging, deeply alien form of respect. The general looked at Vial. "The Broken One speaks the truth of the metal. Our ships bleed, as do theirs." Corv lowered himself back into his support frame. The immediate threat of violence evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted reality. Vial looked down at Declan. The terrifying, unreadable mask of the Sovereign was gone. In its place was an expression of profound, quiet awe. She had needed an anchor. He had just stopped a tidal wave. She turned back to the table, her black eyes locking onto Ambassador Carter. "We will draw a new border," Vial stated, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "Oakhaven will be a dead zone. Neither human nor Elysian will touch its soil. It will remain a monument to the ashes. The mining fleets will withdraw from Aegis. In exchange, my fleet will pull back to the Kalen Tor relay." She placed her hand on the basalt table. "Draw the paper, Ambassador," Vial commanded. "We are finished here." It took another hour for the aides to frantically rewrite the treaty parameters. Nobody spoke much. The grand theatrical posturing had been completely gutted by the mechanic in the unbuttoned shirt. When the digital document was finally projected onto the basalt table, Ambassador Carter pressed his thumb to the authorization pad. His hand was shaking. Vial did not use a pad. She reached out her sharp, dark fingernail, slicing a shallow cut into the palm of her other hand. She pressed her bleeding palm against the basalt, leaving a glowing, iridescent grey handprint on the stone beneath the holographic text. The Elysian generals clicked their mandibles in unison, a solemn, binding oath. The war was over. There was no cheering, just a collective shuddering exhale from the human side of the room. General Briggs stood up, refusing to look at Declan, and marched out of the theatre. Carter practically collapsed into his chair, wiping his face with a silk handkerchief. Vile turned away from the table. Her generals fell into formation behind her. But before she walked away, she looked at Declan. "Walk with me," she said. Declan pushed himself up from the chair. His knee screamed in protest, a sharp spike of pain that made him wince, but he ignored it. He followed her out of the theater, leaving the politicians to their paperwork. They walked in silence down the sterile corridors of the station. The Elysian guards kept a respectful distance ahead and behind, creating a bubble of privacy. The tension that had choked the station for days had vanished, replaced by a strange, hollow quiet. They reached the massive blast doors of Hangar Bay 4. The Elysian dreadnought sat waiting, a jagged shadow against the bright lights of the hangar. Vael stopped at the base of the boarding ramp. She turned to face him. Without the swirling mist or the high-stakes theater of the negotiation room, she just looked tired. The bioluminescent veins at her throat pulsed with a slow, weary rhythm. "They will punish you," Vael said softly. "Your generals. They do not like to be shamed by those they consider beneath them." "Let them try." Declan snorted a genuine cynical smirk, crossing his face. "I'm the guy who told off General Corv and lived. I think my union rep can get me out of whatever Briggs throws at me. Besides, they still need someone to fix the atmospheric scrubbers in Sector 4. Vael tilted her head, her black eyes studying him with an intensity that made the hangar fade away. "You do not have to remain here, Declan. There is a place for you among the fleet. You would not touch rust again. You would be honored as Kylendar." Declan's breath hitched. For a second, a wild, insane part of him considered it. To leave the station, the military hierarchy, the cheap whiskey, and fly into the dark with the alien queen he had bled for. But he looked down at his boots, scuffed and stained. He looked at his hands. "I'm a human Vael," he said quietly, the smirk fading. "I belong in the dirt and the grease. It's what I know. Your world, it's too big for me. I fixed the engine today. That's enough." Vael stepped closer. The scent of ozone and crushed time washed over him, a smell he knew he would never forget. She didn't argue. She understood the stubborn, deeply rooted nature of the creature standing before her. Slowly she raised her hand. Declan didn't tense this time. He didn't brace himself. He just stood still as her cool, blunt fingertips brushed against the scarred ruin of his jawline. The static charge was softer now, a warm, lingering hum that seeped into his skin. The metal burned. Vael whispered, repeating the words that had bridged the gap between their species. But the steel held. "Yeah," Declan murmured, his throat tight. "It held." She lowered her hand. The connection severed, leaving the air between them suddenly cold. Vael turned and walked up the ramp, her dark robes flowing behind her like a shadow. She didn't look back as the heavy hull doors hissed shut, sealing her away. Declan stood in the hangar and watched the black ship lift off the deck. It glided silently backward, passing through the atmospheric shield and out into the endless starry void. He was alone again. A broken mechanic on a rusty space station. He reached up his fingers, tracing the uneven ridges of his scar. It didn't hurt anymore. The phantom ache of the fire was gone. In its place, there was just the quiet, steady rhythm of his own pulse. Declan turned his collar up against the chill of the hangar, put his hands in his pockets, and began the long walk back to the maintenance bays. He had engines to fix. If you loved this story of raw human grit facing down an alien empire, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans who crave real grounded storytelling without the cliches. What did you think of Declan's final choice? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more deeply emotional, heavy-hitting sci-fi and HFY dramas sent straight to your feed, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Your support keeps the engines running and the stories coming. See you in the next one.